I need a husband by tomorrow morning, or I lose $3 billion. Josephine Carmichael didn't blink as she slid a heavily redacted contract across the dusty oak workbench. Nathaniel Brooks wiped sawdust from his calloused hands, looking from the staggering figure printed on the page to the desperate, icy billionaire standing in his workshop. He had a daughter needing a $250,000 surgery and absolutely nothing left to lose. His next words didn't just save her corporate empire. They unlocked a devastating web of betrayal neither saw coming. Nathaniel Brooks was exhausted. At 34, his life was measured in inches of hardwood, overdue bills, and the rhythmic beeping of the pediatric cardiology monitors at Mount Sinai Hospital. His daughter, Madeline, had been born with a ventricular septal defect that had suddenly worsened. The experimental surgery she needed wasn't covered by his insurance, and the out-of-pocket cost was a staggering $280,000. For 6 months, Nate had been working grueling 14-hour days as a master carpenter, restoring the grand staircase of a sprawling Tribeca penthouse, owned by the notoriously reclusive tech billionaire, Josephine Carmichael. He had only seen her twice. Both times she was a blur of tailored charcoal silk and ringing cell phones, dismissing everyone in her path. That was until the night of October 14th. It was nearly midnight. Nate was packing up his tools, the scent of varnish heavy in the air, when the private elevator chimed. Josephine stepped out, looking entirely unraveled. Her usually pristine raven hair was windblown, and her eyes, a sharp, piercing amber, were wide with an uncharacteristic panic. She was flanked by her fiercely loyal general counsel, Beatrice Gallagher, who clutched a leather briefcase like it was a shield. "Everyone is gone?" Josephine asked, her voice echoing in the empty, cavernous living room. "Just me, Ms. Carmichael," Nate said, snapping his toolbox shut. "I was just leaving." "Don't!" Josephine said sharply. She paced the length of the room, her Louboutins clicking rhythmically against the reclaimed hardwood Nate had installed the week prior. She stopped and looked at him. Really looked at him. Nate was tall, built broad from years of manual labor, with tired hazel eyes and a jawline dusted with rough stubble. He was a ghost to the paparazzi, completely untethered from the venomous high society circles of Manhattan. "Beatrice, is he clean?" Josephine demanded, not taking her eyes off Nate. "Nathaniel Brooks," Beatrice recited from memory, pulling a tablet from her briefcase. "No criminal record. Honorable discharge from the Army Corps of Engineers, widowed 4 years ago. Credit score is abysmal, currently facing bankruptcy due to medical debt. Specifically, his 7-year-old daughter requires immediate cardiac surgery." Nate felt a hot flash of anger. "Excuse me, you ran a background check on your carpenter." "I run background checks on everyone who breathes the air in my home, Mr. Brooks," Josephine countered, stepping closer. "And right now your financial ruin is the only reason I am about to offer you the most absurd proposition of your life." She gestured to Beatrice, who extracted a thick stack of legal documents and laid them on the unfinished kitchen island. "My grandfather, Elias Carmichael, was a brilliant man but a traditionalist tyrant," Josephine began, her tone clipping with tightly controlled rage. "He founded Carmichael Global. He also placed a morality and stability clause in the family trust. I turn 32 tomorrow at midnight. The trust explicitly states that to inherit his controlling 51% stake in the company I built into a modern tech behemoth, I must be married. If I am not, the shares default to my uncle, Alistair Beaumont." Nate stared at her, uncomprehending. "So, call a billionaire boyfriend. What does this have to do with me?" "Because Alistair just paid off my fiancée to flee to Monaco this morning," Josephine said, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. "My uncle has been orchestrating a board coup for 6 months. He knows I am backed into a corner. If I lose those shares, Alistair will dismantle the company and sell it for parts. Tens of thousands of people will lose their jobs. I will lose my life's work." She slid the contract across the island. I need a husband by tomorrow morning. A legal, ironclad marriage on paper. In exchange, I will wire $300,000 directly to Mount Sinai Hospital the moment the ink is dry on the marriage certificate, and I will pay you an additional $2 million when we quietly divorce in exactly 1 year. Nate looked at the paper, then at Josephine. The silence in the penthouse was deafening, broken only by the distant hum of Manhattan traffic below. You're serious, Nate breathed, his heart hammering against his ribs. 300,000, Maddie's surgery. He had spent the last week agonizing over which loan shark to call, weighing his physical safety against his daughter's life. Deadly, Josephine replied. There are rules. We will live together in my estate in the Hamptons. Alistair will have private investigators watching our every move, so the cohabitation must look legitimate. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement with a $50 million penalty for breaching it. You will act the part of a fiercely private, devoted husband. In return, your daughter gets to live, and you never have to swing a hammer again unless you want to. Nate looked down at his hands, scarred and calloused. He thought of Maddie, pale and frail against the white hospital sheets, holding a stuffed rabbit and asking when they could go to the park again. He didn't hesitate. Where do I sign? Less than 12 hours later, Nate stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit chambers of Judge Harmon in downtown Manhattan. The irony wasn't lost on him. The last time he was in a courthouse, it was to finalize his late wife's agonizing probate. Now he was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit that Beatrice had miraculously procured at 6 a.m., standing next to a woman whose net worth rivaled small nations. Josephine wore a stark, impeccably tailored white blazer and matching trousers. She looked less like a bride and more like a CEO preparing for a hostile takeover. Do you, Nathaniel, take Josephine? The judge droned, clearly heavily compensated to ask no questions and expedite the paperwork. I do, Nate said, his voice steady. He glanced at Josephine. Her jaw was clenched so tight he could see the muscle feathering beneath her pale skin. I do, she echoed when it was her turn, her tone completely devoid of emotion. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss. Josephine simply held out her hand, and Nate shook it. It was a business transaction, sealed with a gold band sliding onto his finger. The moment they stepped out of the courthouse, Beatrice handed Josephine an encrypted tablet. The wire transfer to Mount Sinai cleared 10 minutes ago. Madeline Brooks is scheduled for surgery tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. under Dr. Eris Thorne, the best pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon on the East Coast. Nate exhaled a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 6 months. A heavy, suffocating weight lifted off his chest, instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of what he had just done. Thank you, Nate said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. Josephine didn't look at him, her eyes glued to the screen. Don't thank me, Mr. Brooks. You earned your advance. Now it's time to earn the rest. An hour later, they walked through the glass double doors of Carmichael Global's towering headquarters. The air in the executive boardroom was thick with tension. Alistair Beaumont sat at the head of the long mahogany table, a smug, aristocratic smile playing on his lips. He was flanked by conservative board members who had long resented Josephine's aggressive, modern leadership. Josephine, darling, Alistair purred as she entered. I was beginning to think you wouldn't show, as the clock strikes noon. I believe it's time to discuss the transition of power. It's a shame about your fiancé. Sudden cold feet, I heard. Josephine smiled, a terrifying, razor-sharp expression. She tossed a thick, leather-bound folder onto the center of the table. It landed with a heavy thud. No transition will be necessary, Alistair, she said smoothly. My grandfather's stipulations have been met in full. Gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to my husband, Nathaniel Brooks. Nate stepped into the room. He commanded the space naturally, his broad shoulders and steady gaze drawing the immediate attention of the room. He didn't look like a terrified pawn. He looked like a man who wasn't easily intimidated. Alistair's smile vanished. He snatched the folder, flipping through the certified marriage license and the trust activation documents. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is a farce, a stunt. Who the hell is this man? A week ago you were engaged to a venture capitalist, and today you're married to a nobody?" "Careful, Alistair," Nate said, his voice a low, warning rumble that surprised even Josephine. He stepped up to the table, leaning his knuckles against the wood. "I prefer fiercely private over nobody, and I'd appreciate it if you spoke to my wife with a little more respect." The room went dead silent. Josephine looked at Nate, a flicker of genuine shock registering in her amber eyes. She hadn't scripted that. Alistair stood up, leaning over the table, his eyes locked on Nate. "You think you can play in this league, Mr. Brooks? I don't know where she found you or how much she paid you, but I will tear your life apart to prove this is a fraud." "You're welcome to try," Josephine said coldly. "But as of this moment, my shares are vested. My position as CEO is permanent, and this meeting is adjourned." As they walked back to the private elevator, Josephine waited until the doors slid shut before turning to Nate. "That was dangerous," she snapped. "Do not provoke him. Alistair is venomous, and he has unlimited resources." "He was disrespecting you," Nate replied calmly, loosening his tie. "If we're supposed to be in love, I'm not going to stand there and let some corporate vulture talk down to my wife. It ruins the illusion." Josephine stared at him, briefly disarmed. "Just stick to the script. We move to the Hamptons estate on Friday. Your daughter's recovery will take place there." Maddie's surgery was a complete success. When Nate saw his little girl open her eyes in the ICU, her cheeks already flushing with a healthy pink color that had been absent for months, he broke down and wept into his hands. Every ounce of his dignity, his freedom, was worth this. 3 days later, a private medical transport brought Maddie to the Carmichael estate in East Hampton. It was a sprawling 10-acre property overlooking the ocean, protected by high stone walls and a small army of private security. Maddie, still weak but wide-eyed, stared at the massive marble foyer as she was wheeled inside. "Daddy, is this a castle?" she whispered. "It's a big house, sweetie." Nate smiled softly, brushing her hair back. Josephine stood at the top of the sweeping staircase. She had never been around children. To her, they were unpredictable variables, chaotic elements that didn't fit into spreadsheets or corporate timelines. She walked down the steps stiffly, wearing a silk cashmere sweater and tailored slacks. "Hello, Madeline," Josephine said, awkwardly keeping a few feet of distance. Maddie looked up at the striking billionaire. "Are you my new stepmom?" Josephine froze. The word sounded foreign, heavy. "I am. Josephine. You can call me Josie." "You're very pretty," Maddie stated matter-of-factly, before letting out a soft yawn. "Daddy, I'm tired." Over the next 3 weeks, the estate settled into a bizarre, fragile routine. To the outside world, Josephine and Nate were the picture of a whirlwind, passionate romance. They were photographed accidentally by paparazzi walking the private beach. Nate's arm securely around Josephine's waist, her head resting on his shoulder. It was highly choreographed. Every touch was calculated, every smile timed. But inside the walls, the lines were beginning to blur. Alistair had made good on his threat. He had hired Gavin Royce, the most ruthless private investigator in New York. There were drones spotted flying near the property line, and Beatrice warned them that the household staff was likely being offered massive bribes for information. "We need to share a bedroom," Josephine announced one evening, walking into the library where Nate was reading a book to Maddie, who had fallen asleep on his chest. Nate looked up, keeping his voice low. "Excuse me." "The staff," Josephine said, crossing her arms defensively. Royce is digging. If the maids report that we sleep in separate wings, Alistair takes that to a judge to challenge the marriage on the grounds of fraud. You're moving into the master suite tonight. Nate gently maneuvered Maddie onto the plush velvet sofa, covering her with a throw blanket. He stood up, towering over Josephine. Fine, but I take the couch in your room. My bed is a California king, she replied dismissively. We are adults. We can manage to share a mattress without an incident. That night, lying in the dark, the cavernous master suite felt suffocatingly small. Nate lay rigidly on the far edge of the mattress, staring at the ceiling. Josephine was on her side, facing away from him. Thank you, Josephine whispered suddenly into the darkness. Nate turned his head. For what? Alistair's lawyers audited my trust today. They found nothing. The marriage is ironclad. You saved my company, Nate. It was the first time she had used his first name without it being a performance for the cameras. You saved my daughter, Nate replied quietly. We're even. I don't do even, Josephine murmured, her voice sounding incredibly tired. In my world, someone always owes someone else. My grandfather taught me that trust is just a liability waiting to be exploited. Your grandfather sounds like he died very lonely, Nate said honestly. Josephine didn't reply for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick, lacking the icy armor she wore during the day. He did, and I was terrified I was going to do the exact same thing. The next morning, the fragile peace shattered. Nate was in the kitchen making pancakes for Maddie when Beatrice stormed through the back doors, her face pale. Josephine came rushing down the stairs a moment later, her phone pressed to her ear. What's wrong? Nate asked, setting the spatula down. Alistair didn't just hire a PI, Josephine said, her voice shaking with a rage Nate hadn't seen before. He hired a forensic accountant. They dug into your past, Nate. Nate frowned. I have nothing to hide. My debts were medical. Not your debts, Beatrice interjected, slapping a file onto the marble counter. Your late wife. Before she died, she took out a massive life insurance policy. But the payout never went to you. It was routed through a shell company in the Cayman Islands. Nate felt the blood drain from his face. What are you talking about? Sophie didn't have life insurance. We paid for her treatments out of pocket. It's why I went bankrupt. She did, Josephine said, stepping closer, her amber eyes locking onto his. A $3 million policy, and the signatory who authorized the transfer to the offshore account wasn't your wife, Nate. It was Alistair Beaumont. The kitchen spun. Nate gripped the edge of the counter, his mind racing, trying to piece together the impossible information. Sophie had worked as a junior analyst at Carmichael Global 5 years ago, before she got sick. Alistair stole my wife's life insurance. Nate breathed, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Worse, Josephine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I think Alistair is the reason she got sick in the first place. The silence in the kitchen was absolute, save for the rhythmic, agonizing ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the hallway. Nate felt as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked from the room. He stared at Josephine, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the horror she had just laid at his feet. His late wife, a casualty of corporate greed. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. Say that again. Nate's voice was a low, dangerous gravel. His hands, usually so steady and precise, trembled as he gripped the edge of the marble island. Tell me exactly what you mean, Josephine. Josephine did not flinch. She stepped closer, her amber eyes reflecting a mixture of deep sorrow and cold, calculating fury. She motioned for Beatrice to open the file. Beatrice, looking grim, spread out a series of highly classified corporate documents, bank transfers, and internal memos dating back 5 years. 5 years ago, Josephine began, her voice steady but laced with disgust. Alistair was spearheading a new division for Carmichael Global, a rare earth mining and battery manufacturing initiative called Project Apex. Your wife was assigned as a junior environmental analyst for the division. Her job was to assess the safety protocols of a new chemical compound they were testing for lithium extraction. Nate looked down at the papers. He recognized his wife's neat, looping handwriting on the margins of one of the reports. A phantom pain radiated through his chest. She told me she was working on battery efficiency. She never mentioned hazardous chemicals. Because Alistair forced everyone in that division to sign non-disclosure agreements with ruinous penalties, Beatrice interjected softly. The compound they were using was a highly unstable, toxic solvent. It was cheaper than the industry standard, but prolonged exposure without proper hazmat protocols was lethal. Your wife flagged the danger. We have the emails. She sent 3 urgent memos to Alistair, warning him that the ventilation in the testing labs was failing and that the compound was aerosolizing. He ignored her, Nate whispered, the realization crashing down on him like a physical blow. He didn't just ignore her, Josephine said, her jaw tight. He buried the reports. He authorized the continuation of the testing to meet a lucrative government contract deadline. 3 months later, your wife was diagnosed with aggressive acute myeloid leukemia. It wasn't a tragic twist of genetic fate, Nate. It was toxic exposure. Nate stepped back, his chest heaving. The memories of those sterile hospital rooms, the agonizing chemotherapy sessions, the way his wife had withered away while fighting so desperately to stay alive for their baby girl. It all rushed back, tainted now with a black, suffocating rage. She hadn't just died. She had been murdered for a quarterly profit margin. And the life insurance? Nate asked, his voice cracking. Guilt money, Beatrice explained, pointing to a wire transfer receipt. Alistair knew he was liable. He took out a massive corporate life insurance policy on her behind your back. When she passed, he forged her signature to route the $3 million payout into a Cayman Islands shell company he controls. He profited off her death to fund his own private ventures. A blinding red-hot fury ignited in Nate's veins. He turned on his heel, heading straight for the back door. "Where are you going?" Josephine demanded, stepping into his path. "To Manhattan," Nate snarled, his eyes dark with a violent promise. "I'm going to tear his throat out with my bare hands." "No, you are not!" Josephine grabbed his forearms. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Nate, look at me. If you touch him, you go to prison. Maddie loses her father. Alistair wins. He spins it to the press that my new husband is a violent, unstable brute. He invalidates our marriage, takes my company, and he gets away with murder." Nate stopped, his chest heaving as he stared down at her. "He killed her, Josie. He killed my wife and left me bankrupt while my daughter was dying." "I know," Josephine whispered, the ice in her demeanor cracking entirely. For the first time, she looked genuinely heartbroken. She slid her hands down to his wrists, holding him firmly. "And we are going to destroy him for it. I promise you, Nathaniel. We will take away his money, his freedom, and his name. But we do it my way. We build a trap he can't escape." Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic in the Hamptons estate shifted radically. The fabricated romance for the cameras became a secondary concern. Late at night, the sprawling library transformed into a war room. Nate and Josephine spent hours poring over heavily encrypted ledgers, architectural blueprints of Alistair's properties, and corporate hierarchies. Nate found himself seeing a completely different side of the billionaire. Stripped of her public armor, wearing oversized cashmere sweaters and nursing cups of black coffee at 3 a.m. Josephine was brilliant, relentless, and fiercely protective. She wasn't just fighting for her company anymore. She was fighting a crusade against the rot in her own family. One evening, a thunderstorm battered the coastline, rattling the massive windows of the library. Nate was sitting on the floor, surrounded by architectural schematics. When Josephine walked in, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of bourbon. She handed him one and sat cross-legged on the floor next to him, a stark contrast to her usual poised elegance. "He keeps the physical ledgers in a private vault at his estate in Greenwich," Josephine said, pointing to a dot on a digital map projected onto the wall. "He doesn't trust digital servers for his offshore accounts. He's paranoid." Nate took a sip of the bourbon, the liquid burning a pleasant trail down his throat. Paranoia means physical security, biometrics, seismic sensors, armed guards. "Can you get past them?" she asked, turning to look at him. Nate met her gaze. The proximity between them was electric, charged with weeks of shared adrenaline and a growing, undeniable intimacy. "Before I was a carpenter, I was an army engineer. I used to build secure bunkers for command outposts. I know how to break a structure down to its bones. If it was built by human hands, I can get inside it." Josephine stared at him, the amber of her eyes catching the dim light of the reading lamp. "You are terrifyingly capable, Mr. Brooks." "I have a lot of motivation, Mrs. Brooks," Nate murmured. She didn't look away. The silence stretched between them, heavy and warm. Josephine reached out, her fingers gently brushing a smudge of graphite off his jawline. Her touch was hesitant, almost as if she expected him to pull away. He didn't. He leaned into her palm slightly, the exhaustion of the past weeks momentarily vanishing. "We're going to win," Josephine whispered, her eyes dropping briefly to his lips. "I know," Nate replied, his voice dropping an octave. The distance between them was practically non-existent when the library doors creaked open. They both pulled back instantly as Maddie shuffled into the room, rubbing her eyes, her stuffed rabbit dragging on the floor. "Daddy, there's thunder!" she whimpered. Nate was on his feet in a second, scooping his daughter into his arms. "I've got you, Bug. It's just a little rain." Josephine watched them, a profound, unnameable ache blooming in her chest. She had built an empire of glass and steel, but sitting on the floor of her library, looking at the scarred carpenter and his fragile daughter, she realized she had absolutely no idea how to build a home. But for the first time in her life, she desperately wanted to learn. The Carmichael Global Annual Charity Gala was the crown jewel of Manhattan's autumn social season, held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was a dazzling display of wealth, power, and high society politics. This year, it was also a battlefield. Nate stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite, adjusting the cuffs of a midnight blue tuxedo. He looked like he belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine. A far cry from the sawdust-covered man who had signed his life away just a month ago. The bathroom door opened, and Nate's breath hitched in his throat. Josephine stepped out. She wore a backless, floor-length gown of liquid gold silk that clung to her curves and caught the light with every movement. Her raven hair was pinned up in an elegant, intricate style, and a simple, devastatingly expensive diamond collar rested against her collarbone. She looked like a goddess of war preparing for a coronation. "You look," Nate started, realizing his mouth was slightly dry. "Incredible!" A genuine, warm blush crept up Josephine's neck. Beatrice brought in a small army of stylists. The goal is to project absolute, untouchable dominance. Alistair will be there, and he will have the board members in his ear all night. We need to remind them who owns the throne. Nate stepped closer, offering her his arm. "Let's go remind them." The arrival at the Met was a blur of blinding camera flashes and screaming paparazzi. As they stepped out of the Maybach, Nate instinctively placed a protective hand on the small of Josephine's back, shielding her from the aggressive crush of photographers. It was a gesture of genuine care, not performance, and Josephine leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his solid presence. Inside the Temple of Dender, the gala was in full swing. The room glittered with champagne towers and Manhattan's elite. Almost immediately, the whispers started. Eyes tracked their every movement. "Smile, darling," Josephine murmured, raising her champagne flute as a group of conservative board members approached. "The wolves are circling." For the next 2 hours, Nate played the role of the devoted, enigmatic husband to perfection. He deflected probing questions with charming, polite deflection, his blue-collar roots completely masked by a quiet, commanding confidence. He didn't try to speak corporate jargon. Instead, he spoke with the quiet authority of a man who knew his own worth, which only served to unnerve the wealthy elite, who were used to sycophants. Then the orchestra struck up a slow, sweeping waltz. "Dance with me," Josephine whispered, setting her glass down. Nate led her to the center of the floor. As he pulled her close, one hand on her waist, the other clasping hers, the rest of the room seemed to blur into insignificance. "You're natural at this," Josephine said, looking up at him as they swayed to the music. "I'm just holding on to the most beautiful woman in the room and trying not to step on her dress," Nate replied, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her chest. Josephine's breath hitched. She looked into his hazel eyes and realized, with a terrifying jolt of clarity, that she wasn't acting anymore. The iron walls she had built around her heart for 32 years were crumbling to dust. "Nate." Before she could finish the thought, a cold, aristocratic voice sliced through the moment. "A touching display. Truly worthy of an Oscar." They stopped dancing. Alistair stood at the edge of the dance floor, swirling a glass of scotch. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, but his smile was pure venom. "Alistair," Josephine said coldly, her grip tightening on Nate's hand. "I see they let you out of your crypt for the evening." Alistair chuckled, stepping closer. "Enjoy the evening, Josephine. It's going to be your last as CEO. My forensic team is very close to proving this sudden, passionate romance is a contractual fraud. And when they do, the trust reverts to me." He turned his gaze to Nate. "And you, Mr. Brooks. I must admit I'm impressed you clean up so well. But a stray dog in a tuxedo is still a stray dog. How much will it cost for you to walk away? 5 million? 10? Name your price, take your sickly little girl, and disappear." Nate didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply let go of Josephine's hand, stepped directly into Alistair's personal space, and backed the older man into a marble pillar. The movement was so swift and fluid that Alistair's private security didn't even have time to react. "Let me make this very clear for you," Nate whispered softly, his eyes dead and cold. "You don't have enough money to buy my soul. And if you ever mention my daughter's name again, I won't need a forensic accountant to ruin your life. I'll take it apart with my own 2 hands. Do you understand me?" Alistair's face paled, genuine fear flickering in his eyes as he looked at the raw, uncontained violence in Nate's expression. He swallowed hard. Nate stepped back, adjusting his cuffs. He offered his arm to Josephine. "My wife and I were dancing." They walked away, leaving Alistair visibly shaken. The ride back to the Hamptons was silent, but the air inside the car was thick with unspoken tension. The adrenaline of the confrontation, combined with the intoxicating proximity of the dance, had stripped away the last pretenses between them. When they walked through the front doors of the estate, the house was dark and quiet. Beatrice had taken Maddie to a movie marathon in the West Wing, ensuring they had the main house to themselves. Josephine kicked off her heels, dropping them onto the marble floor. She turned to face Nate. "You shouldn't have threatened him. He's dangerous." "He threatened Maddie," Nate countered, stepping closer. "And he threatened you. I'm not going to stand by and let him think he has the upper hand." "Nate, this was supposed to be a business arrangement," Josephine said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked up at him, her amber eyes wide and vulnerable. "You were supposed to be a transaction. Does this feel like a transaction to you?" Nate asked, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He reached out, his calloused hands framing her face, his thumbs gently tracing her cheekbones. "No," Josephine breathed. "It feels like the most dangerous thing I've ever done." Nate didn't wait another second. He closed the distance, pressing his lips to hers. The kiss was explosive, born of weeks of repressed tension, grief, and a desperate, blinding need. Josephine gasped, her hands immediately tangling in his hair, pulling him closer. Nate wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the ground as she wrapped her legs around him. There were no cameras, there was no Alistair. There was only the raw, undeniable truth that the fake marriage had become the most real thing in either of their lives. He carried her up the sweeping staircase, the world outside the estate, entirely forgotten, leaving the battle for tomorrow. The rain hammered against the windshield of the black unmarked SUV. Nate sat in the driver's seat, staring through the downpour at the imposing iron gates of Alistair Beaumont's Greenwich estate. Beside him in the passenger seat was Wyatt, Beatrice's head of private security, a man who spoke little, but possessed a terrifying array of tactical skills. "The board meeting started 10 minutes ago," Wyatt said, checking a glowing tablet. "Josephine is filibustering the quarterly projections. Alistair is locked in the boardroom in Manhattan. We have exactly 90 minutes before his security sweep changes shifts." Nate nodded, his face a mask of stone. He was dressed in dark tactical gear, a heavy canvas bag resting at his feet. The romantic haze of the previous night had burned away with the sunrise, replaced by cold, calculated purpose. Today was the day he avenged his wife and secured his family's future. "Let's go," Nate said. They moved like shadows through the torrential rain, bypassing the perimeter cameras thanks to a looping algorithm Beatrice had quietly uploaded to Alistair's security network. Nate's military engineering background made navigating the exterior defenses child's play. He found the blind spot near the eastern retaining wall and scaled it, pulling Wyatt up behind him. Alistair's mansion was a fortress of limestone and glass, but every fortress had a flaw. Nate had spent 3 days studying the architectural blueprints Josephine had acquired. He knew the master vault wasn't in the basement. It was built into the foundation of the second-floor library, disguised as a structural load-bearing wall to avoid drawing attention on standard floor plans. They bypassed the biometric lock on the terrace doors by overriding the external junction box, a trick Nate had learned building secure embassies in Kabul. Inside, the house was dark and silent. They moved silently up the grand staircase. Nate's heart pounded a steady, adrenaline-fueled rhythm against his ribs. Every step felt like walking through a minefield. They reached the library. It smelled of rich mahogany and old paper. Nate moved straight to the eastern wall, running his hands along the ornate wooden paneling. He knocked gently on the wood, listening to the resonance. "Here," Nate whispered. "It's a false front. The steel casing is behind the oak." Wyatt handed him a specialized thermal drill. "We have 12 minutes before the internal motion sensors reboot from the loop." Nate went to work. His hands were steady as he bored through the wood and hit the high tensile steel of the vault. He didn't need to blow the door. He just needed to compromise the analog locking mechanism Alistair arrogantly believed was unhackable. Nate inserted a fiber optic scope into the drilled hole, watching the internal tumblers on a small screen. "Left 3 clicks. Right 7, Nate muttered, his carpenter's precision translating perfectly to the delicate art of safecracking. With a heavy metallic thunk, the locking bar disengaged. Nate pulled the heavy door open. Inside the small vault were stacks of bearer bonds, a velvet box of diamonds, and what they had come for. A thick, leather-bound ledger and a secondary encrypted hard drive. Nate grabbed both, shoving them into a waterproof pouch. "Got it," Nate said. "Let's move!" Suddenly the library doors flew open. The lights snapped on, blinding them. "I wouldn't move another inch, Mr. Brooks," a voice sneered. Nate turned slowly. Standing in the doorway was Gavin Royce, Alistair's private investigator, flanked by two massive armed security contractors. Royce was holding a suppressed pistol, aimed directly at Nate's chest. You didn't really think Alistair would leave his home completely vulnerable just because he was in Manhattan, did you? Royce smiled thinly. He anticipated Josephine might try something desperate. I just didn't expect the carpenter to do the wet work himself. Wyatt tensed, his hand hovering near his hip holster, but the contractors instantly raised their weapons, aiming at his head. Hands where I can see them, Royce commanded. Toss the bag! Nate's mind raced. He was cornered. The ledger was in his hands, but he was staring down the barrel of a gun. If he died here, Maddie would be orphaned. Josephine would lose everything. Royce, Nate said, his voice completely calm, devoid of any panic. Alistair is paying you what? 500,000 a year? $1 million. Enough to put a bullet in you and drop you in the Long Island Sound, Royce replied. Josephine Carmichael is worth $11 billion, Nate said, locking eyes with the investigator. If you pull that trigger, she will spend every waking moment of the rest of her life hunting you down. She will buy the politicians, she will buy the police, and she will buy whoever you care about. You will never sleep again. Royce hesitated, just for a microsecond. But a microsecond was all an army engineer needed. Nate didn't go for a gun. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a small, heavy cylindrical object, a high-lumen tactical flashbang. He pulled the pin and dropped it directly at his own feet. Close your eyes, Nate roared to Wyatt. Royce yelled in surprise. The room erupted in a blinding flash of white light and a deafening, concussive crack. Nate, having shut his eyes and turned his head, lunged forward through the smoke and disorientation. He tackled Royce around the waist, driving him hard into the antique desk. The gun clattered to the floor. Wyatt engaged the two blinded contractors, utilizing brutal, efficient close-quarters combat to drop them to the carpet. Nate pinned Royce to the floor, driving a heavy forearm into the man's throat. Tell Alistair he left his vault unlocked, Nate hissed, grabbing the dropped bag. Nate and Wyatt bolted from the library, sprinting down the hallway as the mansion's main alarms finally began to wail, a shrill siren piercing the Connecticut rain. They vaulted over the terrace balcony, sliding down the wet stone pillars, and vanished into the tree line, just as local police cruisers began wailing in the distance. An hour and a half later, Nate walked into the executive boardroom of Carmichael Global in Manhattan. He was soaked to the bone, his tactical gear dripping water onto the pristine corporate carpet. His knuckles were bruised and a small cut on his cheek bled sluggishly. Alistair was mid-sentence, lecturing the board, when the doors swung open. He stopped, staring in absolute horror as the bleeding, soaked carpenter walked into the room. Nate walked straight to the head of the table. He didn't say a word. He simply unzipped the waterproof pouch and slammed the thick, leather-bound ledger directly onto the mahogany table in front of Alistair. The heavy thud echoed through the silent boardroom. Josephine, sitting at the opposite end of the table, smiled, a terrifying, triumphant, and devastatingly beautiful expression. The trap had closed. The mahogany boardroom table seemed to stretch for miles, dividing the room into two distinct battle lines. At one end stood Alistair Beaumont, his face drained of all color, his aristocratic composure shattering like fragile glass under the weight of the soaked, leather-bound ledger. At the other end sat Josephine Carmichael, entirely unbothered by the silence that had sucked the air from the room. Water dripped from Nathaniel's tactical gear, pooling on the imported Persian rug. The silence stretched until it became agonizing. The 13 members of the Carmichael Global Board of Directors, titans of industry, hedge fund managers, and political power brokers, stared at the terrifying man who had just bypassed the most secure building in Manhattan. "What is the meaning of this?" demanded a senior board member, adjusting his spectacles nervously. "Alistair, who is this man?" Why is he bleeding? This man, Josephine said, her voice cutting through the tension like a finely honed blade, is my husband, and what he just placed on the table is the unedited, physical ledger of my uncle's offshore shell companies. Alistair lunged forward, his hands trembling as he reached for the ledger. This is stolen property. It's fabricated. Josephine, you have lost your mind. Security! Get this animal out of my boardroom. Nate didn't move an inch. He simply placed a heavy, bruised hand flat on top of the book, stopping Alistair in his tracks. The raw, barely contained violence in Nate's hazel eyes made the older man recoil instinctively. I wouldn't touch that, Alistair, Nate growled, his voice a low vibration that rattled the crystal water glasses on the table. Your fingerprints are the only ones on these pages. Let's keep it that way. Beatrice Gallagher, Josephine's fiercely loyal general counsel, stood up from her chair and walked briskly to the table. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of pristine, white legal envelopes, sliding one to every board member. While Mr. Brooks was acquiring the physical evidence, Beatrice announced, her tone entirely professional. I took the liberty of coordinating with our external legal counsel at Cravath, Swain & Moore, as well as the White-Collar Crimes Division of the FBI. The envelopes in front of you contain the digital footprint of Project Apex. The boardroom erupted into chaotic murmurs as the directors tore open the envelopes. Project Apex was shuttered 5 years ago, one director stammered, flipping through the pages. It was deemed an environmental liability. It was shuttered, Josephine corrected sharply, standing up and commanding the room with absolute authority. But not before Alistair bypassed safety protocols to meet production deadlines. He subjected his own employees to aerosolized toxic solvents. It caused irreversible cellular damage to multiple workers. Josephine turned her gaze to Alistair, who was now sweating profusely, backing away toward the glass doors. And when a brilliant junior analyst flagged the hazard when she tried to save her co-workers, Alistair buried her reports. Josephine continued, her voice rising, echoing with righteous fury. When she subsequently developed terminal cancer, he took out a $3 million corporate life insurance policy on her. He forged her signature. He routed the payout through a J.P. Morgan Chase holding account straight into a Cayman Islands fund. The board members gasped. This wasn't corporate espionage. This was depraved, cold-blooded murder disguised as a balance sheet. Lies! Alistair shouted, his voice cracking, the aristocratic veneer entirely gone. She's trying to frame me to keep her grandfather's shares. She hired a thug to manufacture evidence. Nate took a step forward, his towering presence casting a long shadow over Alistair. The analyst was my wife, and you let her die while you lined your pockets. You let my daughter watch her mother wither away. You bankrupted my family, and you bought a yacht with the blood money. Alistair looked wildly around the room, seeking a single ally. But the board members were seasoned sharks. They knew a sinking ship when they saw one, and Alistair was already underwater. They looked at him with sheer disgust and self-preservation. You're done, Alistair, Josephine said softly. As if on cue, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Wyatt stepped inside, leading a team of 4 FBI special agents wearing Navy windbreakers. Alistair Beaumont, the lead agent said, stepping forward with a pair of steel handcuffs. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and suspicion of gross criminal negligence, resulting in death. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. For a moment it looked as though Alistair might fight. He puffed out his chest, his face purple with rage. You cannot do this to me! I built this division! I am a Beaumont! Josephine! You vindictive little... Wyatt grabbed Alistair by the shoulder, spinning him around forcefully. The agent slapped the cuffs onto his wrists, the metallic click, sounding like a gunshot in the silent room. As they dragged the protesting, humiliatingly defeated billionaire out of the boardroom, Nate felt the crushing weight that had lived in his chest for 4 years finally fracture. The ghost of his wife could finally rest. The man who had destroyed his family was going to die in a federal prison. Nate turned to look at Josephine. She was already looking at him. In a room full of the most powerful people in the world, they were the only two who existed. Josephine turned to the remaining board members. My uncle's shares are hereby seized by the federal government, pending the investigation, stripping his voting rights. My controlling stake remains absolute. The meeting is adjourned. She didn't wait for their murmurs of assent. She walked around the table, taking Nate's bruised hand in hers, and led him out of the room. The fallout was catastrophic for the Beaumont name, but a complete triumph for Josephine. Over the next 3 weeks, Carmichael Global's stock soared as the market reacted favorably to Josephine's ruthless purging of corruption. The media hailed her as a visionary who had cleaned house, a fierce protector of ethical capitalism. But inside the sprawling Hamptons estate, a heavy, suffocating silence had taken hold. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The autumn leaves had turned a brilliant fiery orange, falling across the manicured lawns. Nate was in the library, packing a set of rare, leather-bound books he had been reading to Maddie. His daughter was currently upstairs, her laughter echoing as she played hide-and-seek with Beatrice, her health improving miraculously with every passing day. The heavy oak doors opened, and Josephine walked in. She was wearing her armor, a slate-gray tailored suit, her hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate chignon. She carried a thick manila folder. Nate stopped packing. He looked at her, his heart performing a painful, heavy rhythm. Ever since the night of the gala, ever since the kiss on the stairs and the raid on the vault, Josephine had retreated behind an impenetrable wall of ice. She had avoided him, burying herself in legal meetings and press conferences. "You're packing," Josephine observed, her voice devoid of inflection. "Maddie is cleared for standard travel by Dr. Thorne," Nate said quietly. "The trust requirements are permanently satisfied. Alistair is awaiting trial without bail. Our arrangement is technically concluded." Josephine swallowed hard. She walked to the large mahogany desk and placed the folder down. "I had Beatrice draft these. They are expedited annulment papers. The judge has already signed off, citing irreconcilable differences kept entirely private. The press will simply think we had a passionate, brief romance that fizzled out." Nate stared at the folder. It looked exactly like the contract that had brought them together. A transaction. A piece of paper dictating the course of his life. "I see," Nate said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Additionally," Josephine continued, her tone dangerously close to robotic, as if she were reading from a teleprompter to keep herself from shattering, "I have authorized the transfer of the final $2 million to your account. I also recovered the $3 million Alistair stole from your wife's insurance. It has been placed in a trust for Madeline, accessible when she turns 18. Nate took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "Josie, look at me." She refused, keeping her eyes fixed on the annulment papers. "You don't need to stay here anymore, Nate. You have your daughter. You have your financial freedom. You never have to swing a hammer again." "Why are you doing this?" Nate asked, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion. "After everything we've been through, after the gala, after what we did together. Are you really going to tell me this was just a business deal to you?" Josephine finally looked up, and Nate was shocked to see her amber eyes swimming with unshed tears. The Ice Queen was weeping. "My company killed her, Nate," Josephine whispered, the words tearing out of her throat. "My family's legacy is the reason your wife died. It is the reason your daughter almost grew up without a mother. The reason you went bankrupt." "That was Alistair," Nate insisted, reaching out to grab her shoulders. "That wasn't you." "It's my name on the building!" Josephine cried out, stepping back, pulling away from his touch as if she didn't deserve it. "I am a Carmichael. My grandfather built this empire on ruthlessness, and Alistair poisoned it. Every time you look at me, every time you see my name in the press, you are going to be reminded of the people who destroyed your life. You are a good man, Nathaniel. You are honorable and kind, and you love your daughter more than anything in this world. You do not belong in my world. My world is venomous. Nate stood frozen. He saw the absolute crushing guilt radiating from her. She wasn't pushing him away because she didn't care. She was pushing him away because she believed she was toxic to him. "So that's it?" Nate asked, his jaw clenching as he tried to rein in his own breaking heart. "You make the executive decision for both of us." "It's already made," Josephine said, swiping a stray tear from her cheek and instantly rebuilding her walls. "The cars are waiting outside to take you and Madeline wherever you wish to go. Thank you, Mr. Brooks, for your services." The formality felt like a knife to the gut. Nate looked at her for a long, agonizing moment. He wanted to fight. He wanted to shake her and tell her she was wrong. But he also knew the stubborn, relentless willpower of the CEO standing in front of him. If she had decided she was unworthy of being loved, nothing he said in this room would change her mind. Nate walked to the desk, picked up a gold fountain pen, and signed the annulment papers without reading them. "Goodbye, Josephine," Nate said. He didn't look back as he walked out of the library. An hour later, Josephine stood on the balcony of the master suite, watching the black SUV drive through the wrought iron gates, taking the carpenter and his little girl away. The sprawling estate had never felt so massive, so silent, and so entirely empty. She had won her empire, but as she fell to her knees on the cold marble floor, she realized she had just lost the only thing she had ever truly wanted. 6 months later, the spring air in the small coastal town of Camden, Maine, was crisp and smelled of salt and pine. The town was a haven of quiet working-class resilience, entirely removed from the glittering, cutthroat towers of Manhattan. Nate stood in the center of his new workshop, running a piece of sandpaper over the smooth edge of a custom cherry-wood dining table. He had bought a modest piece of land overlooking the harbor. He had set up a college fund for Maddie, donated half of the insurance money to pediatric cardiac research at Mount Sinai, and used the rest to open his own bespoke carpentry business. He didn't need to work, but the wood kept his hands busy, and busy hands kept his mind from wandering to a penthouse in Tribeca. "Daddy!" Nate turned, smiling as Maddie ran into the workshop, her cheeks flushed pink from the ocean breeze. She was wearing a tiny pair of denim overalls, carrying a handful of wildflowers she had picked from the yard. She was the picture of perfect health. "Hey, Bug!" Nate laughed, scooping her up and spinning her around. "Those are beautiful. For the kitchen table." "Yep." Maddie nodded vigorously. She paused, looking at her father with the innocent, piercing intuition only a child possesses. "Are you sad today, Daddy?" Nate's smile faltered slightly. He tapped her on the nose. "I'm just tired, sweetie. Go put those in water." As Maddie skipped back to the house, Nate turned back to his workbench. He pulled his phone from his pocket, opening a news app. He didn't want to look, but it had become a daily ritual. The headline was plastered across the financial section. "Josephine Carmichael steps down as CEO of Carmichael Global, appoints Beatrice Gallagher as successor, announces $2 billion Workers' Health Foundation." Nate stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. She had stepped down. The woman who had faked a marriage to save her company had just voluntarily walked away from the throne. A sudden crunch of gravel in the driveway pulled him from his thoughts. Nate walked to the open bay doors of his workshop and froze. A sleek black town car was parked in the driveway. The driver's door opened and a familiar, imposing figure stepped out. Wyatt gave Nate a subtle, respectful nod before opening the rear passenger door. Josephine stepped out into the main sunlight. She wasn't wearing a tailored power suit or a silk gown. She wore a simple pair of dark jeans, a cream-colored knit sweater, and leather boots. Her raven hair was loose, blowing wildly in the ocean breeze. She looked nervous. The impenetrable billionaire CEO was gone. In her place was a woman who looked like she was about to risk everything. Nate wiped his hands on a rag, his heart hammering against his ribs as he stepped out of the workshop to meet her halfway. "You're a long way from Wall Street, Josie," Nate said, his voice thick with an emotion he had buried for 6 months. I don't work on Wall Street anymore," Josephine replied, taking a hesitant step closer. She looked around at the modest workshop, the small farmhouse, and the ocean in the distance. "It's beautiful here." "It's quiet," Nate agreed. "Why are you here, Josephine?" She took a deep breath, looking directly into his hazel eyes. "Because I was a coward. 6 months ago, I pushed you away because I was terrified. I was terrified of what my family had done to you, but mostly I was terrified that I was actually capable of loving someone, and that eventually you would realize I was too broken to love you back." Nate didn't interrupt. He let her speak, seeing the incredible vulnerability it cost her to strip away her armor. "I spent my entire life building walls to protect a company that my grandfather built," Josephine continued, taking another step closer, until she was only inches away from him. "But without you and Maddie, the company meant absolutely nothing. It was just glass and steel and lonely bank accounts. I stepped down. I liquidated my grandfather's trust. I set up a foundation for industrial workers in your wife's name. I burned the toxic legacy to the ground, Nate." Nate stared at her, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she had done. "Josie, you didn't have to give up your empire for me." "I didn't," Josephine smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that lit up her amber eyes. "I gave it up for myself. I came here for you." She reached into the pocket of her sweater and pulled out a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside rested a simple, unadorned gold wedding band. "6 months ago, I told you I needed a husband by tomorrow morning to save my company," Josephine whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "Today, I'm asking if you need a wife. Not for a contract, not for a board of directors, just for us. Because I am entirely, hopelessly in love with you." Nate didn't look at the ring. He looked at the woman who had fought a war for him, the woman who had torn down her own kingdom just to stand in his driveway. He closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. He kissed her, not like the desperate, adrenaline-fueled kiss on the staircase, but with a deep, profound certainty. It was a promise. Josephine wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in the world. "Josie!" They broke apart, laughing as Maddie came sprinting out of the farmhouse. The little girl didn't hesitate. She launched herself at Josephine. Josephine caught her, lifting Maddie into her arms with a natural ease she hadn't possessed 6 months ago. She hugged the little girl tight, burying her face in Maddie's hair. "Did you come to live in our castle?" Maddie asked, beaming. Josephine looked over Maddie's shoulder at Nate, who was leaning against his workbench, watching them with an expression of pure, unadulterated love. "Yes, sweetheart," Josephine smiled, tears of joy tracing down her cheeks. "I'm finally home." If you love this story of a billionaire CEO risking it all for a single dad, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good twist. Nathaniel and Josephine proved that true wealth isn't found in a bank account, but in the family you fight for. Want more epic tales of fake marriages, turning real ultimate karma, and dramatic romance? Subscribe to our channel right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below. What would you do if a billionaire offered you an ultimatum?